Champion Briefs is excited to announce its first installment of Congressional Debate and Extemporaneous Speaking Briefs, which is multifaceted. But the first facet is rooted in what happened in the news, specifically targeting what happened in the news in the summer of 2014. My name is Isabella Peretti, and I competed in extemporaneous speaking for Cypress Bay High School in Weston, Florida for the past 4 years, in addition to serving as an instructor of Congressional Debate at the Champion Briefs Institute in Davie, Florida this past summer. So I hope I can impart a little bit of my expertise to all of you on issues both international and domestic. So without further ado, let's get started on what happened in the past couple of months. Starting with something unfortunate on the domestic front. On August 8th of 2014, a young man named Michael Brown, an unarmed 18-year-old who was seemingly innocent, was shot and killed by a police officer from his own town, that of Ferguson, Missouri. Now, this conflict has a few other issues that are underlying, not only the death of an innocent victim, but of the protests that have erupted in the wake of it. The LA Times reported on August 13th of 2014, the protests are going on and on in Ferguson today, with people wearing shirts saying, "Hands up, don't shoot," all in solidarity for that of Mr. Brown. But even greater than that is the tactics that the police force in Ferguson, Missouri have been implementing to mitigate this conflict and these protests. Not only have they used tear gas and rubber bullets, but it highlights a greater issue of a more militarized approach that the police force in Ferguson, something that is not unique to just the greater St. Louis area, but unfortunately is becoming a bigger problem throughout the United States, is especially notable. The Guardian explained on August 14th of 2014 that 2 years ago, the Greater St. Louis Police Department, of which Ferguson is a part of, acquired a Lanco Bearcat armored military vehicle, which is a tactical support vehicle, and a helicopter that's popular with the Korean Air Force. Further, this year, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security donated a 22-ton mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle, the same thing that's used on the ground by United States troops in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Now, this has created a situation that's really just negative for everyone involved. As the St. Louis Dispatch published in an editorial on August 12, 2014, they're clamoring for attention, especially that of their governor, Jay Nixon, a Democrat, who, as Matt O'Brien, previously a writer for The Atlantic magazine, explained in a tweet on Thursday morning, that it's too bad Missouri apparently doesn't have a governor. Ouch. But President Barack Obama is confident in Mr. Nixon's abilities, and while on vacation in Martha's Vineyard on August 13th of 2014, he issued a statement saying that he believes in Mr. Nixon. We sure hope he's right. But this conflict does indeed provide not only some information to all of us to evaluate, but more so some questions for all of you participating in debate, like what the role of a police force really should be, the role of a governor in an issue that is more local in nature, and finally the black-white dichotomy that's present in Ferguson. For while 90% of the 52 men and women police force is constituted of white civilians, 2/3 of the civilians in Ferguson holistically are African American. As such, there may be a bit of a power struggle when it comes to that of race, and we have to be cognizant of the fact that this can be deleterious to a society. But when we come back to that of the issue of President Barack Obama and his statement, we find that Ferguson isn't the only thing on his agenda. More so, it's the ongoing rumors of a potential impeachment for our president. And while the New York Times published a report on August 10th of 2014 explaining that the case for suing President Obama is weak, Fox News begs to differ, and this is largely a Republican-led threat. Now, we're looking at an age-old dispute about executive power, specifically with regard to deporting roughly 11 million undocumented immigrants. Now, this is something that is usurping the power of the legislative branch and is very much predicated on the executive branch, because President Barack Obama does not want to deport these immigrants. He did something relatively similar in 2012 with Young Dreamers, essentially illegal immigrants who were here more for school and simply enriching the United States economy and society. But today, Eric Posner, a law professor at the University of Chicago, wrote that the main effect of this proposal, brought forth by President Barack Obama, would just to be simply recognizing an already current practice in the status quo. But it doesn't mean that an impeachment rumor and an impeachment threat still isn't on the table, because we're finding that politicians dictate policy, and as long as Republicans fear a strong executive power, one at the helm, President Barack Obama, a Democrat, there is always that threat. Back in 2007, in a particularly successful 2006 midterm election, Nancy Pelosi fended off many Democrats who wanted to impeach Mr. Bush when he had some questionable anti-terrorist policies. So hopefully we'll find someone on the opposing side backing up President Barack Obama. If not, then more impeachment rumors will circulate, and will certainly only allow for his approval rating and his numbers to continuously dwindle. But on the issue of not only dwindling approval rating, but also of the Hispanic voter bloc that's so important and so closely tied to legal immigrants in our countries, we find that we really need to be aware of that voter bloc and its implications in the midterm elections. Because we're finding that among Hispanics, President Barack Obama's approval rating is significantly decreasing, with around 46% disapproving of President Barack Obama's current policies, 34% approving, and 20% sitting on the fence. They're unsure. And that was explained by Real Clear Politics on August 12th of 2014. President Barack Obama and all of the Democrats are going to need that important voting bloc if they want to be successful, not only in the far-off future, but also November of this year with the midterm elections. So let's talk about the midterm elections. There have been a few shakeups. Perhaps one thing that's most important to be aware of is that of a Republican-flavored ad for Democrats, something explained by Politico.com in an article entitled "Running as a Democrat Sounding Like a Republican." Pretty self-explanatory, but something all of you congressional debaters and especially extempers should really be aware of going into any issues about midterm elections or just the changing political schema and landscape come the end of 2014. Now, Democrats, hampered by President Obama's rising in popularity and conservatives turning out at higher levels in midterm elections, have taken a very conservative approach, very literally, by using many Tea Party-backed methods in order to garner the most amount of votes by November. Now, we've seen this in place already by New Hampshire Representative Ann McLean Custer, whose district broke for Obama by an 11 percentage point margin in 2012, but now is running an ad that touts her support for small business tax cuts and for supporting their local microbrewery. This is not exactly something that once was supported by a more liberal agenda. And former State Senator Stacey Appel, in a district President Barack Obama won by 4 percentage points back in 2012, is talking about the dangers of overspending in state government, which is a more populist theme that is oftentimes brought up by Tea Party Republicans. It's a very different methodology. And finally, Colorado Democrat Andrew Romanoff, who's running in a district that President Barack Obama won in both 2012 and 2008, is airing a commercial that seems very reminiscent of commercials aired by Tea Partyists. Now, we hope these are successful for those Democrats who are hoping to hold on to some form of support in the House. For a big question that we all need to be aware of is whether or not the Republicans can truly hold on to the House, for it seems that the Senate is pretty safe. But with that bearing that in mind, we find that the Republicans aren't completely foolproof in their own approach to hold on to the House, one, and to maintain any form of stability when it comes to that two-party system in which the Democrats seem to be gaining in popularity, and Republicans are looking a little bit shaky, which is highlighted in Eric Cantor, the House Majority Leader's recent loss in the Virginia primary. He lost to someone named Dave Brandt, who spent $100,000 on his campaign, juxtaposed against Mr. Cantor's $1 million. Now, this seemed to be a seat that was very much locked up, but as Paul Krugman, Nobel laureate, explained in the New York Times on June 12th of 2014, an article I strongly encourage all of you to read, that there could be a little bit of a change when it comes to that of the way that Republicans view their party, especially when they're pushing more towards extremism, something that is definitely brought up by the Tea Party movement that has been taking place ever since the late 2000s. So let's look to the fact that this low taxes, light regulation, Dave Brandt, a Tea Party-backed Republican, was successful nonetheless. He's a Virginia economics professor in college, and he has a very different approach to that of Mr. Cantor. In an Economist article from June of 2014 entitled "So, Who is Dave Brandt?" they explain that he has an ideology that's very Randist in nature. Now, they mean Rand on a dual approach. Not only is it like Ayn Rand, the author who explained something called objectivism, a theory that really did value the idea of laissez-faire capitalism and a let others do what they want to do kind of mentality, but also that of a Rand Paul, the closest thing to libertarian that we're seeing in the Republican front for 2014 and even into 2016, potentially. but no official rumors about him running for office have actually become tangible or have truly surfaced. But he does retain a strong position in the political landscape of the Republican Party. So let's talk a little bit about what Paul Krugman explained in his article about bait and switch, something that he explained happened in the 2004 election with George W. Bush, who won that re-election by posing as a champion of national security and traditional values. Keep in mind, this was indeed in the wake of 9/11, in which traditional values got him to that skyrocketed approval rating that we haven't seen since. Now, he ran against the defender of gay marriage, the defender of terrorism abroad, or rather, exposing that of terrorism and going after the root cause, or at least what he told Americans the root cause was. But as Thomas Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas, explains, that ultimately many Republicans have taken the approach of mobilizing voters with more social issues, but then turned the post-election season into serving the interests more so of corporations and the more high-class populace of the United States. So we see that that's something that Mr. Cantor had been implementing in his past few elections, one in which he would talk about how fiercely he opposed things such as gay marriage, but then turned more to dealing with those on Wall Street. A very near and dear approach for Mr. Cantor, but something that Mr. Pratt has the complete opposite idea of, very much focusing on economics from the beginning, which is something that Virginia voters truly responded to, which forces us to ask questions like, what will come of the Republican Party? What's going to happen in the midterm elections? And most importantly, is the two-party system on the decline? And by two-party, I mean that between the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States. So, let's talk a little bit more about some concerns in domestic policy, with Miss Clinton, Hillary Clinton that is, opposing that of President Barack Obama's foreign policy. Now, Miss Clinton was an ex-Secretary of State under the Obama administration, but that doesn't mean that she didn't have any doubts when it came to the approach that Mr. Obama wanted to implement to hopefully eradicate many of the issues omnipresent not only at home, but mostly abroad. Now, she came to Jeffrey Goldberg, an author for The Atlantic magazine, and explained some of her chief concerns, how there's been rampant inaction in Syria, and how that ultimately helps build up a lack of a credible fighting force of people. And now the Islamists, the secularists, and all those in between have come together to create a big vacuum of which extremism has only filled that vacuum up with. Now, Hillary Clinton may or may not have a point, but it brings up a greater concern in that when there is a kind of schism in the ideology with regard to foreign policy between two people that once worked so closely together, it does not bode well for President Barack Obama and his administration. But it also signifies perhaps a change in the approach that Hillary Clinton is taking to maybe be successful come 2016. Now, once again, despite all the bumper stickers ready for Hillary, there hasn't been any official notice by Ms. Clinton that she will be running. But the fact that she has targeted President Barack Obama's foreign policy, something that has been a little bit questionable in recent months, to bring upon her own foreign policy agenda, is something that definitely brings a good road ahead of her in the election season. And after the Benghazi scandal was cleared up by a bipartisan group of congressional members back in late June, we found that Ms. Clinton very well may not have any obstacles in her way come 2016. But keep in mind, that's up to you. Look at some cool articles by Foreign Policy in Focus that explain why Hillary Clinton may have a harder chance than she perhaps had anticipated with regard to foreign policy. But finishing up this story, we found that Hillary Clinton and President Barack Obama on an August 13th, 2014 party in the Hamptons hugged it out on issues of foreign policy. So hopefully there's no bad blood, even though this does signify a change on the foreign policy schema. So, talking of foreign policy, let's move finally to international relations and what transpired in the international realm in the summer of 2014. Let's start first with Ukraine and Russia, an issue that's probably near and dear to many public forum debaters after the most recent PF topic. But keep in mind, for all of you congressional debaters and extempers, there's a lot to be garnered of what happened in these recent months. First, we looked at the fact that Viktor Yanukovych, who was once the president of Ukraine, was ousted on February 21st of 2014 because he was perceived by the Ukrainian people to be too closely tied to the Russian president Vladimir Putin. And maybe they were correct. Now, the explicit reason as to why they ousted him, that is, the Ukrainian parliament, was because of the fact that he wasn't taking any tangible efforts to effectively bring Ukraine closer and closer to the European Union with EU membership. Now, because no plans were made, Vladimir Putin was absolutely thrilled, but the people of Ukraine weren't so much, which is why there was definitely an outcry against him. In May of 2014, the lack of a president was replaced by, well, a president, Petro Poroshenko, who won decidedly by 54% of the vote, and hopefully is able to curb many of that Russian tie, or rather anti-Russian tie sentiment that seems to be so popular in Ukraine today. And after a successful and official referendum bringing the annexation of Korea on a more real scope, we find that all the people who are in Ukraine who favor that of Ukrainian nationalism really do want someone like Poroshenko to be leading the way, because he does not have ties to Russia. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The Council on Foreign Relations explained in May of 2014 that Poroshenko, or as he's affectionately nicknamed, the Chocolate King, because he was once the CEO of a candy company in Ukraine, is a man who has strong ties to the West, which is something that the United States, the UK, and the EU have been cautious not to be too excited about. Because while they do, of course, want a leader in Ukraine who doesn't exactly side with Putin, they don't want to seem that Mr. Poroshenko is a puppet to the Western ideologies that Ukrainian people are still a little bit weary about. But let's look to the fact that in July of 2012, Bloomberg explained the occurrence in which Malaysian flight MH17 was shot down. Now, this was done by Ukrainian separatists using Russian-supplied ground-air missiles. Now, what this showed is that there's still a small faction of Ukrainians, those that are on the east, who still side more so with Ukraine. Those who are on the west are, well, more westernized in their own beliefs. Now, this small faction was enough to create a very violent and tangible outburst. But it doesn't mean that all hope is lost for Ukraine, because we're finding that the United States is increasing the amount of sanctions against Russia, hoping to curb the influence of Russia economically in Ukraine, also with some boots on the ground still there to maintain a sense of order, in addition to hopefully stopping efforts by Russia, where there is now talk and rumors of taking over Moldova or Transnistria next. All of this hopefully will not occur. But it's going to require the efforts not only of Ukraine and Poroshenko, but of the international community to prevent Russia from taking what they believe is rightfully theirs, headed by the always fierce leader, Vladimir Putin. So some things to be aware of are what is going to happen next, and should the United States do more? This brings us back again to that of foreign policy by the United States and President Barack Obama. While we need a realist approach that is based somewhat on peace, we should be thinking about if military action is a good thing. Maybe even a little. Now, let's talk a little bit about that of Israel and Palestine. The Al Monitor on June 26th of 2014 explained that the reason there has been a bit of an outburst with regard to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, an age-old conflict that really has been going on since 1947 over possessions of the Gaza Strip and areas throughout what Israel was established as a state, were due to the fact that that Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, accused Hamas, a militant group, of kidnapping and murdering 3 Israeli teens in the West Bank. Israeli security forces rearrested some of these Palestinian ex-convicts released in the Shalit deal back a couple years ago and accused them of recidivism. Now, more importantly, we saw that this was also met by a rally of rockets from Gaza that followed. Netanyahu wants to degrade Hamas's military capabilities and restore the calm, but politicians on the right have asked for a broader ground operation that may decisively beat Hamas, which is something that has been on the Israeli agenda for years now. Now, let's talk a little bit about Hamas before we go on. The Council on Foreign Relations, in one of its backgrounders, backgrounds are something on Council on Foreign Relations that you can look up on a separate tab that are exceptionally helpful in getting the background information on myriad topics. But anyway, Hamas is a Palestinian military movement that serves as one of the territory's 2 major political parties. Its rival party is Fatah, which dominates the Palestinian Liberal Operation Organization, which has renounced violence, at least right now. Now, this is a nationalist Islamist spin-off of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, which was largely in the news in Egypt with Mr. Morsi and issues of that sort. In late 2013, and a little bit into this year, Hamas was founded in in 1987, and later emerged as one of the forefront in armed resistance against Israel, and taking back what the Palestinian people, in a very extremist measure, perceived as rightly theirs. So keep in mind that the issue in Israel and Palestine is ostensibly due to these 3 teens that were murdered, but also due to the fact that the conflict has just not been ended. It's something that both Israelis and Palestinians have not been able to come up with a conclusive solution to. So keep bearing in mind that this issue retains weight for the upcoming season. Now, let's talk a little bit about Iraq and ISIS, or ISIL, the Islamist State in Iraq and Syria, or the Levant. Now, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi joined with Ansar al-Islam, or Partisans of Islam, a militant Kurdish separatist movement for whom he led the group's Arab contingent, and that group has been rising since the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States, in which we saw an eradication of a Sunni-led government to be replaced with a Shiite faction. That Sunni government retreated to the Anbar province, in which it was allowed to militarize to join forces with militant Kurdish people in Iraq, and also to team up with that of al-Qaeda and, of course, of Syrian forces. Now, this is a mix that just does not bode well for the stability of Iraq, and unfortunately has required some United States attention, because the ISIS group is extremely scary and extremely militarized. And that's because many who were a part of the Iraqi military pre the United States invasion in 2003 were eradicated when the United States took hold. And all of those who were part of the military needed some livelihood, some way to keep a roof over their head for their families, and ultimately turned to extremism through ISIS in achieving that paycheck, but did so in a way in which they had a lot of skills and a lot of expertise that makes them particularly scary for the state of Iraq. In April of 2013, Iraqi security forces raided a protest camp in al-Hawija, protesting an escalation in Sunni militancy. Now, car bombings, suicide attacks initiated and intensified, with coordinated attacks regularly targeting Shiite markets, cafes, mosques, and 7,000 civilians died in 2013, making it the bloodiest year since 2008. Now, the United Nations explains that that increase in violence has only surged since the beginning of 2014. Now, the International Crisis Group explained on August 13th of 2014, on Thursday afternoon, confirming that the success in humanitarian efforts by President Barack Obama and American forces has led to thousands to be allowed to evacuate Mount Sinjar, a huge point of ISIS control in Iraq. Now, food, water is dropped to these civilians, but ultimately these humanitarian efforts are not enough to curb the militancy and the extremism of the Sunni Muslims. The United States has deployed some troops, and in an announcement made by President Barack Obama late last week, he said that there is no definitive timetable for how long the United States will be involved. Now, let's talk about something that's a little bit less military, but probably just as scary, that of the Ebola virus that is unfortunately taking hold throughout of West Africa. 2 American patients, Nancy Whiteburl and Kent Brentley, one of which a doctor serving in West Africa, were both unfortunately given the Ebola virus when abroad. And in doing so, the United States took very drastic measures by administering a not yet proven or tested drug to these 2 patients. But luckily, the results were relatively successful. These 2 patients are being flown back to the United States, but the Ebola virus has once again resurfaced as an issue of international attention, brought forth by the World Health Organization, or WHO, as it's affectionately called, to be an international state of emergency or crisis. And as the Wall Street Journal explained on August 12th of 2014, international precautions have been being made, and that experimental drug that was pretty successful for the 2 American patients is now being somewhat mass-produced, to about 800 doses. Now, the Ebola virus is so dangerous because there isn't actually a cure. It targets internal organs, and in only a couple of days or even a week or so, patients are finding themselves dying, and a long and painful death. This is something that has been very prominent in Africa and now has only resurfaced bigger and badder than ever. Finally, for this week, let's talk about the Pope in South Korea. Now, Pope Francis's first trip to Asia was supposed to be a momentous and beautiful occasion for the South Korean people. It was indeed an honor, but unfortunately, North Korea fired 3 short-range missiles on the day that the Pope was slated to arrive. The last missile coming in 35 minutes before the Pope's plane arrived in South Korea. Luckily, the Pope was safe. But this exhibition of violence, and most importantly the utilization of missiles, shows that North Korea still isn't afraid to mess around. And if it means infringing upon that of South Korean diplomacy, prominence in the geopolitical schema, they will be happy to do so, and they have done so, by affecting this very highly publicized occurrence. So let's keep in mind that North Korea and South Korea are still suffering from a tumultuous relationship, one in which North Korea won't stop at anything to get their way. So this concludes our very first edition of What Happened in the News, especially targeting the summer of 2014. I hope you enjoyed and that you stay tuned.